When my daughter-in-law started crying at the will reading, everyone thought it was grief, but I knew better. Her sobs came too fast, too loud, like she was performing for a room she believed had already crowned her the winner. I remember the way she pressed a tissue to her eyes without actually touching the tears, how she leaned into my son's shoulder just enough for the lawyer to notice. It was a quiet room. Beige walls, stale coffee, a ticking clock that sounded louder than it should have, and yet her crying filled every corner. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, my wedding ring still cutting into my finger even though my husband had been gone for 3 months. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in weeks. Grief had settled into me like sediment, heavy, unmoving, impossible to stir. The lawyer cleared his throat, and that was when everything began to unravel. But to understand why my daughter-in-law cried the way she did and why her tears dried so suddenly, you need to know what our life looked like before death rearranged all of us, before the will, before greed spoke louder than love. I was married to Thomas for 42 years. We weren't one of those loud, dramatic couples who finished each other's sentences or danced in the kitchen every night. Our love was quieter than that. It lived in routines, in the way he warmed my mug before pouring my tea, in the way he always parked on my side of the street so I wouldn't have to cross traffic, in the way we folded laundry together on Sunday afternoons, the radio humming low between us. Our house was modest, a 2-story brick place with creaky stairs and a fig tree in the backyard that never quite produced enough fruit. We raised our son Daniel there. Birthday parties in the living room, homework at the kitchen table, late-night talks when he was a teenager and thought the world was ending because a girl didn't text him back. Thomas was steady, predictable, a man who believed in planning ahead and paying things off early. He worked as an electrical supervisor for the city until retirement, and when he stopped working, he didn't stop being useful. He fixed neighbors' porch lights, volunteered at the community center, kept meticulous records of every bill we ever paid. I teased him about those folders, thick, labeled binders that filled an entire cabinet in his study. "Tom," I used to say, "if anyone ever needs proof we existed, they'll just find your paperwork." He'd smile and tap the cabinet. "Order is kindness," he always said, "especially for the people you leave behind." At the time, I thought he meant me. Thomas married Sophie 8 years ago. She was charming in a way that felt rehearsed, always smiling, always quick to compliment my cooking or my hair or my home. She had a soft voice that went sharp when she thought no one was listening. The first time I noticed it was at Thanksgiving, when she hissed Daniel's name under her breath because he'd poured gravy before she finished taking pictures. I told myself it was nerves, new marriage, new family. Sophie came from nothing, or at least that's how she described it. A childhood of moving apartments, a mother who did her best, a father who disappeared early. She spoke often about survival, about how hard she'd worked to become someone. And I admired that, I really did. But admiration slowly gave way to unease. She asked questions that felt just a little too specific, about the house, about how long we'd owned it, about whether Thomas had a pension, whether we'd ever thought of downsizing. Once, while helping me clean after dinner, she opened a cabinet and whistled softly at Thomas's folders. "Wow," she said, flipping through one. "He's really organized." Thomas laughed. "Someone has to be." Sophie smiled at him, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's smart. Most people don't plan ahead." Her hand lingered on the folder longer than necessary. Daniel didn't notice, or maybe he didn't want to. He was, and still is, a good man, gentle, loyal, sometimes too eager to keep the peace. He adored Sophie in that way men do when they believe love means defending someone at all costs. When Thomas fell ill, everything shifted. It started with fatigue, then dizziness, then a cough that wouldn't go away. The diagnosis came fast after that. Aggressive, terminal, no point in pretending otherwise. I remember sitting in the car afterwards, the hospital doors sliding shut behind us, Thomas staring straight ahead with his hands folded in his lap. "Well," he said quietly, "that explains the tiredness." I laughed then, a strange, brittle sound. He squeezed my hand. Sophie stepped up immediately, too immediately. She began visiting every other day, bringing soups I didn't ask for, offering to drive Thomas to appointments even when I was perfectly capable. She spoke to doctors as if she were already family of record. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and found her sitting at Thomas's desk, his folders spread open like a map. "Oh," she said lightly, standing up. "I was just looking for the insurance information in case of emergencies." Thomas was asleep in his chair. I stood there for a long moment, my chest tight. "I would have found it for you." She smiled again. "Of course, I just thought better to be prepared." That word again, prepared. In his final weeks, Thomas grew quieter. He spent more time in his study, updating documents, writing notes in his careful handwriting. Sometimes he asked Sophie to leave the room when we talked. Sometimes he asked me to close the door. One evening, after she'd left, he reached for my hand. "Promise me something," he said. "Anything." "When the time comes," he whispered, "let the truth stand on its own." I didn't understand then. I wish I had. Thomas died on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was coming up. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, Sophie's doing. She cried loudly at the funeral, clinging to Daniel like she might collapse without him. People told me how lucky I was to have such a devoted daughter-in-law. I nodded, thanked them, kept my thoughts to myself. The will reading was scheduled for 3 months later. Plenty of time for assumptions to grow, plenty of time for Sophie to believe she already knew the ending. And as I sat in that lawyer's office, listening to her cry beside my son, I realized something with startling clarity. Some people mourn the dead, others wait patiently for what they think the dead owe them. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and began with the formalities, names, dates, legal language that felt cold against the warmth of the memory still clinging to me. Sophie dabbed at her eyes, her shoulders trembling just enough to be seen. Daniel kept his arm around her, his thumb moving in slow circles against her wrist, the way he used to soothe himself as a child. I watched them from the corner of my eye. Grief has a way of sharpening your senses. You notice the smallest things, the rhythm of a breath, the way a foot taps when someone is nervous, the silence that falls too quickly. Sophie's crying had a pattern to it, loud when the lawyer paused, softer when he spoke, almost gone when the conversation drifted into things she didn't think concerned her. The will began with the expected: personal belongings, Thomas's tools, his watch, the old radio from the garage. Each item came with a memory. Each memory landed in my chest like a stone. "To my wife," the lawyer read, "I leave my wedding ring, my letters, and the contents of my personal journals." I swallowed hard. Sophie glanced at me then, just briefly, her eyes calculating. The crying didn't stop. "To my son, Daniel," Sophie's grip tightened, "to my father's watch and the funds from the joint savings account." Sophie's sobs grew louder, a hand flying to her mouth. She whispered something to Daniel. I couldn't hear what, but I saw the corners of her lips twitch upward just for a second. That was when I understood. She thought she knew how this would go. I remembered the questions, the folders, the careful way she'd stepped into Thomas's final months like a woman rehearsing a role she believed she'd earned. The lawyer paused again, turning the page, "And to my wife I leave the family home." Sophie's crying stuttered, just a hiccup barely noticeable, before resuming with less conviction. Daniel looked at me surprised. "Mom?" I nodded. I already knew. Thomas and I had talked about it years ago. The house wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was history. It was safety. It was something that couldn't be split without losing its soul. Sophie shifted in her seat. The lawyer continued. All remaining financial assets, investments, and insurance payouts are to be distributed as follows. This was the moment Sophie had been waiting for. I could see it in the way she leaned forward, the way her breathing quickened. To be held in trust. Her sobs stopped. The silence that followed was sharp. In a trust, the lawyer repeated, administered solely by my wife. Sophie blinked once, twice. The trust is to be used for the care and well-being of my wife during her lifetime, and thereafter for charitable donations to the community center and scholarship funds specified in the appendix. Daniel frowned. Wait, what? Sophie turned to him, her face pale now, the tears gone as if they'd never existed. "That can't be right," she said, her voice flat. "There must be a mistake." The lawyer looked at her calmly. "The will is very clear." "What about—" Sophie began, then stopped herself. She glanced at me, her eyes narrowing. "What about Daniel?" "The trust may be used at the discretion of the trustee," the lawyer said, "should the trustee deem it necessary." I felt the room shift. Sophie stood up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "So you control everything?" I met her gaze. "That's what Thomas wanted." Her hands trembled, not with grief now, but with anger. "You knew about this," she accused. "You planned this." Daniel looked between us, confusion written all over his face. "Sophie, sit down." "No," she snapped. "No, this isn't fair." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harris." "This isn't what Thomas promised," she said, her voice rising. "He told me—" She stopped. Too late. The words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel turned to her slowly. "He told you what?" Sophie opened her mouth, closed it, her cheeks flushed red. "I mean, we talked about the future, about taking care of things." I felt a strange calm settle over me, a clarity that came from finally understanding the shape of the truth. "Thomas was very deliberate," I said quietly, "about who he spoke to and what he promised." Sophie laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "So that's it. You get everything and we're just supposed to be grateful?" "No," I said. "You get exactly what Thomas decided." The lawyer gently suggested a break. Outside, Sophie paced the hallway like a caged animal. Daniel followed her, his voice low, urgent. "What did you mean when you said Dad told you something?" She waved him off. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." I stayed seated, staring at the grain of the conference table, listening to the muffled argument through the door. Sophie's voice rose and fell, sharp and defensive. Daniel stayed steady, hurt threading through every word. When they returned, Sophie wouldn't look at me. The lawyer finished the reading. Papers were signed, hands were shaken, condolences offered. As we stood to leave, Sophie leaned close to me. "You think you've won, but you haven't." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and felt no triumph, only relief. Because the truth Thomas had asked me to let stand on its own was already doing its work, and this was only the beginning. The days after the will reading felt heavier than the weeks that followed Thomas's funeral. Grief, I had learned, came in layers. The first was shock, loud and blinding. The second was silence. But this third layer, this one was thick with tension, with unspoken accusations, with the quiet hum of resentment moving through the family like an electrical current you couldn't see but could definitely feel. Daniel stopped calling. At first, I told myself he was busy, processing. mourning in his own way. But when a full week passed without so much as a text, I knew better. Sophie, however, made her presence known. She began dropping by unannounced, always with some thin excuse, returning a casserole dish, picking up something Daniel had forgotten, checking in on me because she was worried. Her concern felt hollow, stretched too tight over something sharp. One afternoon, she stood in my kitchen while I washed dishes, the sound of running water filling the space between us. "You know," she said casually, "managing a trust is a big responsibility." I didn't look up. Thomas believed I was capable. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "It's just, Daniel and I have plans, a family someday. Stability matters." I turned off the tap and faced her. "Is there something you want to ask me?" Her lips pressed together. "I just think Thomas would have wanted his money helping his grandchildren. He made his wishes clear." She laughed softly. "Did he, or did you guide him toward what you wanted?" The accusation landed hard, but I kept my voice steady. "You weren't there at night when he couldn't sleep. You didn't hold his hand when he cried about leaving things unfinished. Don't pretend to know his mind." Her eyes flashed. "I was there plenty." "Yes," I said, "you were." She left shortly after that, her footsteps sharp against the floor. That night, I lay awake replaying Thomas's final weeks, the way he'd asked Sophie to leave the room, the careful way he'd worded his promises. The truth was beginning to take shape, and I didn't like what it revealed. A few days later, I opened one of Thomas's journals. He'd written in them sporadically over the years, observations, reminders, reflections. His handwriting was neat but slanted, the letters pressed firmly into the page like he wanted them to last. About halfway through the last journal, I found an entry dated just 2 weeks before his death. "I've noticed Sophie asking questions again," he'd written. "Not curious questions, strategic ones. I don't believe she understands the weight of what she's asking for, or perhaps she understands it too well." My chest tightened. "I love my son," the next line read, "but love can make you blind. I won't let my life's work become a weapon used against him." I closed the journal and pressed it to my chest. Thomas had seen it coming. The next confrontation came at a family dinner, one I hadn't planned but couldn't avoid. Daniel invited me over, his voice strained but polite. I almost declined. Almost. The house smelled like garlic and roasted chicken. Sophie moved around the kitchen with forced cheer, setting plates down a little too hard. Dinner was quiet, painfully so. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, Sophie and I have been talking." Sophie smiled tightly. "We think it would make sense to revisit the trust arrangements." I set my fork down. "Revisit?" "Yes," Sophie said quickly. "Just adjust things. Make them more fair." "Fair to whom?" I asked. She hesitated. "To us." Daniel reached for her hand. "We're struggling, Mom. You know that." I did know, and I also knew they weren't struggling nearly as much as Sophie liked to imply. "I've been reviewing the accounts," I said calmly, "and I've noticed several attempts to access information you're not authorized to see." Sophie's face drained of color. "What?" "The bank flagged them. Login attempts, password resets, all traced back to your email." Daniel turned to her slowly. "Sophie?" She stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. I was just trying to understand things." "Without asking me or Thomas." She laughed bitterly. "You never would have told me the truth." "The truth about what?" She stared at me, her voice shaking now, not with grief but with fury. "That you planned to cut us out." "I planned nothing. Your assumptions did that for you." The room felt small, too small for the weight of what was finally being said. Daniel stood, running a hand through his hair. "Sophie, did Dad ever promise you anything?" Her silence was answer enough. "He said," she began slowly, "that he didn't want me to worry about my future." My heart sank, not for myself, but for Daniel. "And you heard," I asked gently, "what you wanted to hear." She turned on me. "You think you're so righteous, sitting there with everything, judging me." "I'm not judging you. I'm protecting what Thomas left behind. For yourself. For the man he was." Daniel's voice broke. "Why didn't you tell me about the bank stuff?" She looked at him, panic slickering across her face. "Because you wouldn't understand." That was the moment something shifted between them. I left shortly after, the night air cool against my skin. As I drove home, I felt the ache of loss settle deeper, not just the loss of my husband, but the slow fracturing of my son's marriage. Justice, I was learning, was rarely clean, but it was coming. The call came early one morning, just as the sun was stretching its way through the curtains. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice hoarse, "can I come by?" I knew then that something had finally broken. He arrived an hour later, eyes rimmed red, shoulders slumped like he'd been carrying weight he couldn't put down. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, looking around the house the way people do when they're not sure what still belongs to them. "I didn't know," he said, sitting heavily at the kitchen table. "I swear to you, I didn't know." I poured coffee and set a mug in front of him, the familiar routine grounding us both. "About the bank?" "About any of it," he said. "The emails, the questions, the things she was doing behind my back." I sat across from him, folding my hands. "When did you find out?" "Last night," he said. "I went through our shared email account. There were messages from financial advisors, from lawyers. She'd been asking about contesting the will." My chest tightened. "Did she tell you why?" He laughed weakly. "She said she was just being proactive." Silence filled the space between us. "I loved her," he said quietly. "I still do, but I don't recognize the person she's become." I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. "People show you who they are when they think they're entitled to something." He nodded, swallowing hard. "She's angry at you. She thinks you manipulated Dad." "I know. She wants me to choose." I met his gaze. "And what do you want?" He looked down at his coffee. "I want the truth." So I gave it to him. I told him about the journals, about the questions Thomas had noticed, about the way he'd insisted on clarity in his final months. I showed him the entry, the careful words, the concern threaded through every line. Daniel read it slowly, his breathing uneven. "He was trying to protect me," he whispered. "Yes," I said, "from a fight he knew would come." Daniel stayed for hours that day. We talked about his childhood, about the kind of father Thomas had been, about the pressure Daniel felt to provide, to be enough. When he finally left, there was resolve in his eyes, and grief, sharper now, but more honest. Sophie didn't wait long to make her move. 2 weeks later, I was served papers. She was contesting the will. The accusation was clear and cruel. Undue influence, that I had manipulated my dying husband into rewriting his will to cut out his son and secure my own future. Daniel called me in tears. "I didn't know she was going to do this." "I believe you," I said, but believing him didn't make it hurt any less. The legal process was slow and exhausting. Depositions, meetings, statements dissecting my marriage as if it were a transaction. Sophie's lawyer painted her as a devoted daughter-in-law cast aside by a controlling widow. I sat through it all with quiet dignity, answering every question honestly, calmly. I brought Thomas's journals, his emails, his notes to his lawyer, written in his own hand. Sophie, on the other hand, grew erratic. She contradicted herself, claimed conversations that couldn't be proven, lost her temper more than once in front of people whose job it was to assess credibility. During one deposition, she snapped, "I deserved something." The room went still. The mediator raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" She hesitated. "I was family." "So was his wife," the mediator replied evenly. The case didn't go far after that. The judge ruled in my favor, quickly, decisively. The will stood as written. The day Daniel told Sophie the decision, she packed a bag and left. No dramatic goodbye, no apology, just absence. Months passed. The house felt quieter than ever, but also lighter. Daniel and I rebuilt slowly. Sunday dinners returned. Laughter came back in pieces, tentative but real. He moved into a small apartment nearby, focusing on work, on healing. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch, watching the fig tree sway in the breeze, he said, "She cried at the will reading." I smiled sadly. Yes. He thought it was grief, but now I know. Sometimes, I said, tears come from losing what we thought we were entitled to. He nodded. I used the trust the way Thomas had intended. I paid off small debts, donated to the community center where he'd volunteered, established a scholarship in his name for students studying electrical trades. The money did what money should do. It helped quietly, without controlling anyone. And Sophie? I heard through distant channels that she told people she'd been wronged, that she'd been robbed. I didn't correct the story, because the truth didn't need my voice anymore. It stood just fine on its own. The first winter after everything settled was colder than I expected. Not just outside, though the wind did find every crack in the old windows, but inside me too. Loss has a way of sneaking back in when the noise dies down, when there are no more court dates, no more phone calls filled with tension, no more arguments waiting around the corner. Just quiet. I filled my days the way I always had. Morning tea by the window, a walk around the block after lunch, folding laundry while the radio murmured softly in the background. The routine steadied me, but they also left room for thoughts I couldn't outrun. I missed Thomas in the small ways the most. The creak of his chair in the study, the smell of his aftershave lingering faintly on his sweaters, the way he used to hum off-key when he thought no one was listening. Sometimes I found myself talking to him out loud. "You knew, didn't you?" I'd say, standing in the kitchen. "You saw what I didn't want to see." The house never answered, but in a way it didn't need to. Daniel came by often. He looked different now, quieter, more thoughtful. Pain has a way of sanding down rough edges, of revealing what's solid underneath. One evening, as we washed dishes together, he said, "I keep thinking I should have noticed sooner." I handed him a towel. Love makes blind spots. That doesn't make you foolish, it makes you human. He nodded slowly. I'm angry at her, at myself. That anger has a place, just don't let it move in. He smiled faintly at that. Spring brought small changes. I joined a book club at the community center, started volunteering twice a week, helping organize the scholarship applications. Young people came in with nervous smiles and hopeful eyes, and I saw a little of Thomas in each of them, eager, earnest, ready to build something with their hands. One afternoon, a young woman named Marisol stayed behind after a meeting. "Your husband sounds like he was a good man," she said. "He was," I replied. She hesitated. "Do you ever regret how things ended with your family?" I thought about it for a long moment. "No," I said finally. "I regret that greed tried to speak louder than love, but I don't regret choosing honesty. The truth was, I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled." Sophie faded from our lives the way some storms do, loud, destructive, and then suddenly gone. Every now and then someone would mention her name, usually paired with a shake of the head or a lowered voice. I never joined those conversations. Time has a way of sorting people into stories that fit them. On the anniversary of Thomas's death, Daniel and I visited his grave. We stood side by side, the air cool and still. Daniel placed fresh flowers down, his hand steady. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "for what she put you through." I shook my head. She showed us who she was. That's not something to apologize for. He looked at the headstone, then back at me. Dad trusted you. Yes, and I trusted him. That night, back at the house, I opened Thomas's last journal one more time. The final entry was short. "If you're reading this, then you're stronger than you think. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." I closed the book, my chest tight but warm. Greed doesn't always look cruel at first. Sometimes it looks like concern, like involvement, like love that asks too many questions and listens too little. And grief doesn't always cry quietly. Sometimes it performs. I learned that justice doesn't need shouting. It doesn't need humiliation or revenge. It needs patience, truth, and the courage to let people reveal themselves. When Sophie cried at the will reading, she thought she'd won. But what she lost, trust, dignity, love, was far more costly than anything she imagined gaining. And what I gained wasn't money or control. It was peace. If you were in my place, would you have done the same, or would you have handled it differently? Sometimes the hardest thing isn't letting go of what we love, but standing firm when someone mistakes kindness for weakness. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of someone you've known or something you've lived through, I hope you'll share your thoughts below. These stories don't belong to just one voice. They belong to all of us who've learned that truth has a quiet power of its own. And if you'd like to hear more stories like mine, told slowly, honestly, and from the heart, you know where to find me. After everything was decided, after the papers were signed, the lawyers stopped calling, and Sophie's name became something we spoke less and less, I thought peace would arrive all at once. It didn't. Peace came the way dust settles in an empty room, slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you realize you can breathe without coughing anymore. There were still mornings I reached across the bed expecting Thomas's warmth and found only cool sheets. Still moments in the grocery store when I caught myself picking up his favorite crackers before remembering I was the only one left to eat them. Grief doesn't disappear just because justice was served. It lingers. It reshapes itself. What changed was the weight of resentment, that heavy knot I hadn't fully acknowledged, the one lodged somewhere between my chest and my throat, began to loosen. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped wondering if I could have said something differently, noticed something sooner, protected Daniel better. Regret is clever like that. It convinces you that hindsight is responsibility. One afternoon, months after the court ruling, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. The handwriting was familiar. Sophie. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Part of me wanted to throw it straight into the trash, unopened, let it disappear without ever touching me. But another part, the part Thomas had always trusted, believed in facing things directly. The letter was short. She wrote that she was hurt, that she felt misunderstood, that she had acted out of fear. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the lies, the legal action, the damage done, just explanations. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Explanations are not the same thing as accountability. I didn't respond. That, I realized, was another form of closure. Daniel told me later that Sophie had moved out of state, started over, told a different version of the story wherever she landed, one where she was the victim of a cold, controlling family who never truly accepted her. I didn't argue with ghosts. People who refuse responsibility need villains to survive their own reflection. Instead, I focused on what was in front of me. The house needed work, small things at first, a loose step, a leaking faucet, and then bigger decisions. I painted the living room a lighter color, replaced the old curtains Thomas had never liked but tolerated because I loved them. I kept his study mostly the same, though. The folders still lined up neatly in the cabinet, the desk still smelled faintly of cedar and ink. One evening, as I dusted the shelves, I found an envelope tucked behind a row of books. My name was written on it in Thomas's careful hand. Inside was a single page. I worried about what would happen after I was gone, he'd written, not because of money, but because of people. I trust you to see clearly, to stand firm, and to forgive when forgiveness costs less than holding on. I sat down on the floor and cried then, not the sharp, gasping sobs of early grief, but something quieter, something closer to release. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't about excusing harm, it's about refusing to carry it forward. I forgave Sophie in my own way, without reconciling, without reopening doors that were closed for a reason. I forgave her so her choices wouldn't continue to shape my days. Daniel changed too. He became more deliberate, more attentive, less eager to smooth things over at his expense. He told me once that losing his marriage felt like losing a version of himself he'd outgrown without realizing it. I thought love meant sacrifice, but I never learned where the line was. Most of us don't, until someone crosses it. We grew closer in that season, not in a clinging way, but in a grounded one. Mutual respect replaced the old roles we'd fallen into, mother worrying, son reassuring. We spoke as adults now, shaped by shared loss but not defined by it. On the first anniversary of the scholarship Thomas and I had planned, I attended the award ceremony at the community center. I stood at the podium, hands trembling slightly, and spoke about a man who believed in quiet work, honest effort, and leaving things better than you found them. As I looked out at the young faces listening, I felt something settle in me. Legacy isn't about who gets what, it's about what continues. When I returned home that night, the house felt warm in a way it hadn't before. Not full, but complete. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. Somewhere down the block, a couple laughed, a dog barked. Life went on, indifferent and beautiful. I thought back to that lawyer's office again, the beige walls, the ticking clock, Sophie's tears falling faster than grief ever would. She cried because she thought she'd won. What she didn't understand was that winning was never about money. Winning was about keeping your integrity when temptation knocks, about trusting the people you love enough to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable, about letting go when holding on would cost you your peace. Thomas knew that, and now, finally, so did I. The strange thing about endings is that you rarely recognize them when they arrive. There's no music swelling in the background, no clear line where one chapter closes and another begins. Life just keeps going. Quieter sometimes, softer around the edges. And if you're paying attention, you realize you're no longer bracing yourself for impact every time the phone rings or a letter arrives in the mail. That's how I knew I'd crossed into a different season of my life. Not healed, healing is too neat a word, but settled. I stopped expecting Sophie's shadow to appear at the edges of my days. Her name stopped tightening my chest. Even her letter, tucked away in a drawer, lost its power to stir anything more than mild sadness. What surprised me most was how often people asked me for advice afterward. Neighbors, friends of friends, women I barely knew who pulled me aside at church or the grocery store and whispered, "How did you stay so calm?" Or "How did you not lose yourself in all that?" I never felt qualified to answer. I wasn't calm because I was strong. I was calm because I was tired of fighting battles that only existed because someone else refused to accept reality. There's a quiet strength that comes when you stop trying to convince people to see you clearly. Daniel noticed it too. "You're different," he said one evening as we sat on the porch, the air warm and heavy with summer. "You don't second-guess yourself anymore." I thought about that, about all the years I'd softened my words to keep the peace, smiled through discomfort, given explanations no one had asked for. Maybe, I said slowly, I just stopped asking permission to trust my own judgment. He nodded. Dad would have liked that. That night, after Daniel left, I walked through the house, turning off lights, the familiar ritual grounding me. In the study, I paused by Thomas's desk and rested my hand on its smooth surface. I think we did okay, I said softly into the quiet. And for the first time since his death, the thought didn't make my chest ache. I thought about Sophie then, not with anger, but with clarity. She didn't come into our family planning to betray us, I believe that. She came carrying fear, shaped by a life that taught her security was something you grabbed before someone else did. Somewhere along the line, love became transactional, affection became strategy. That doesn't excuse her choices, but it explains them. And understanding, I learned, is not the same as excusing. Understanding simply allows you to set boundaries without bitterness. If Sophie had come to me honestly, admitted her fear, her insecurity, her desire for control, perhaps things might have unfolded differently. Perhaps Thomas would have still drawn the boundaries, but without the fracture that followed. But honesty requires courage, and courage can't be inherited. As summer leaned into fall, I began downsizing the house, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I donated furniture, gave away books I'd already read twice, let go of objects that had quietly become obligations. Letting go became a practice. Each item I released made space, not just physically, but emotionally. Space for mornings that didn't feel heavy, for laughter that didn't come with guilt, for a future that wasn't defined by what I'd lost, but what I still had. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old papers, I found the program from Thomas's funeral. I'd avoided it for months. The edges were soft now, worn from handling. I sat down and read the words again. Beloved husband, devoted father, steady friend. I realized then that legacy isn't written in wills or legal documents. It's written in how people behave when you're no longer there to guide them. Thomas had trusted me not just with money, but with truth, with restraint, with the dignity of letting people show who they were without interference. And that trust had shaped everything that followed. When Sophie cried at the will reading, she thought she'd won because she believed the story ended with money. She didn't understand that money is only powerful when people are willing to destroy themselves for it. I wasn't, and neither was Thomas. The real inheritance he left me wasn't the house or the trust or the authority to decide how things would unfold. It was the confidence to sit quietly while someone else revealed their intentions. That's a rare kind of peace. These days, when I sit by the window with my tea, watching the world move past my front yard, I don't feel like someone who survived something terrible. I feel like someone who learned something valuable. That love without boundaries isn't kindness, that grief can sharpen your vision instead of clouding it, and that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. If you're listening to this and facing a situation where someone expects you to bend, to give, to stay silent for the sake of harmony, I hope you remember this. You don't owe anyone access to what they haven't earned, and you don't have to raise your voice to stand your ground. So I'll ask you the same question I asked myself in that quiet lawyer's office watching tears fall that had nothing to do with love. If you knew the truth would speak for you, would you have the patience to let it? If this story touched something in you, a memory, a wound, a lesson you're still learning, I invite you to share it below. None of us walk these paths alone, even when it feels that way. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about family, betrayal, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes to choose peace, you know where to find me. Thank you for listening.